The cabin sat like a lone beacon against the howling Montana wilderness, its windows glowing warm against the killing cold of the worst blizzard in 50 years. Sarah pressed her face to the frosted glass, watching three figures stumble through the snow toward her door, their voices barely audible over the wind. "Please, let us in before we freeze." She should have felt pity, should have rushed to unlock the door. Instead, Sarah smiled and placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling something writhe beneath her skin, something that definitely wasn't human. The strangers didn't know that Sarah had been alone in these mountains for 8 months, ever since the thing in the woods had chosen her. They didn't know she'd been waiting, preparing, feeding the growing darkness inside her with small animals and passing hikers. They didn't know that in 3 days, when the moon turned blood red, she would give birth to something ancient and hungry. "I'll let you in," she called through the door, "but only if you promise to help me raise my baby." Silence fell outside, broken only by the wind's relentless shriek. Sarah could almost hear them exchanging glances, weighing their options. The cold was a living thing out there, teeth sharp enough to strip flesh from bone in minutes. They had no choice, and they all knew it. "What? What do you mean?" The voice belonged to a woman, probably middle-aged from the rasp of exhaustion. "Help you how?" Sarah's smile widened. Through the frosted glass she could make out their shapes, 3 dark silhouettes hunched against the storm, one tall, one shorter and broader, one slight and trembling. Perfect. "Just what I said. Stay until the baby comes. Help me care for it. It's so hard being alone up here." Her voice carried the practiced tremor of vulnerability she'd perfected over the months. "I'm due any day now, and I'm scared." The thing inside her pulsed at the lie, a warm flutter that felt nothing like the kicks she remembered from her pregnancy books. This was anticipation, hunger. "Lady, we'll help however we can," called a man's voice, deep and desperate. "Just please, my daughter. She's only 16. She can't last much longer out here." A daughter. Sarah's hand moved in slow circles over her distended belly. How thoughtful of them to bring youth. The entity had been so specific about its needs. She approached the heavy wooden door, her bare feet silent on the cabin's worn floorboards. The locks, 3 deadbolts she'd installed herself, turned with deliberate slowness. The door swung open, and Arctic air rushed in like a living predator, carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. 3 figures stumbled across the threshold, a man in his 50s with a graying beard crusted with ice, a woman about the same age wrapped in insufficient layers, and between them, a teenage girl whose lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. They collapsed near the fireplace, steam rising from their soaked clothing. "Thank God," the woman gasped, pulling the girl closer. "Thank you so much. I'm Helen. This is my husband Mark, and our daughter Chloe. Our car went off the road about 5 miles back." Sarah secured the locks behind them, each click echoing in the cabin's warmth. "I'm Sarah. You're lucky you found this place." Lucky. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. There was no luck involved. She'd been calling to them for miles. Her voice carried on frequencies that human ears couldn't detect but human hearts could feel. The entity had taught her that trick, among others. Mark struggled to his feet, concern etched across his weathered features. "Ma'am, you said you were due soon. Shouldn't you be in a hospital? This storm's supposed to last 3 more days at least." "I prefer it here," Sarah replied, settling into the rocking chair she'd positioned to watch both the fireplace and the door. "It's peaceful, natural, the way birth is supposed to be." Chloe had stopped shivering, her color slowly returning. She was pretty in that fresh-faced way that only teenagers managed, all potential and unmarked by real suffering. Yet, Sarah's belly tightened with what felt suspiciously like a contraction, though she knew it wasn't time. Not quite. "Is there anything we can do to help now?" Helen asked, her maternal instincts apparently extending beyond her own child. "I raised 3 kids. I know how overwhelming pregnancy can be. Just rest for now," Sarah said, though her mind was already cataloguing their strengths and weaknesses. Mark looked capable despite his exhaustion. He'd be useful for the heavier tasks. Helen had that nurturing quality that would prove essential in the early days. And Chloe. The girl was studying the cabin with sharp eyes, taking in details, the heavy curtains drawn tight, the strange symbols carved into the mantelpiece, the stack of books with titles in languages that predated civilization. Observant. That could be problematic. Strange place for a pregnant woman to be alone, Chloe murmured, her voice carrying a note of suspicion that made Sarah's smile falter slightly. Smart girl. Unfortunately, intelligence wouldn't save her from what was coming. "Did you see that?" she called over the storm's rage. Marcus looked up from the generator manual he'd been studying by lamplight. Their power had cut out an hour ago, and the backup was their only lifeline now. "See what? There's someone out there. Multiple people, I think." He joined her at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he squinted into the maelstrom. For a moment, there was nothing but the endless dance of snow. Then a figure stumbled into view, barely upright against the wind, followed by two others supporting someone between them. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "They'll freeze to death out there." The group had spotted their house now. Through the storm, Sarah could see them struggling toward the front porch, their movements desperate and clumsy. One of them raised an arm, waving frantically. Sarah was already moving toward the door when Marcus caught her arm. "Wait. We don't know who they are. They're people who need help," she said, shaking him off. "We can't just watch them die." The pounding on their door came in weak, irregular bursts. Sarah yanked it open, and the wind immediately tried to rip it from her hands. Snow swirled into their entryway as four figures stumbled inside, three adults supporting a fourth who appeared to be heavily pregnant. "Thank God," gasped a middle-aged man with ice crusted in his beard. "We've been walking for hours. Our car went off the road about 2 miles back." The pregnant woman was shivering violently, her lips nearly blue. She couldn't have been more than 19, with stringy blonde hair plastered to her skull and clothes that were soaked through. The other woman, older with sharp features, kept a protective arm around her. "Get them by the fire," Sarah instructed, helping Marcus guide the group toward their living room. "I'll get blankets and something hot to drink." As she busied herself in the kitchen, Sarah could hear the strangers introducing themselves. The bearded man was David, the older woman his wife Catherine. The pregnant girl was Elena, and she was due any day now. "The contractions started about an hour ago," Catherine was saying when Sarah returned with steaming mugs of tea. "Nothing regular yet, but with this stress—" Elena accepted a mug with trembling hands. Up close, Sarah could see she was even younger than she'd initially thought, maybe 17. Her belly was enormous, straining against a thin sweater that offered little protection from the cold. "How far along are you, honey?" Sarah asked gently. 41 weeks, Elena whispered. Her voice had an odd quality to it, almost dreamy despite her obvious discomfort. "She's ready to come out. She's been telling me she's ready." David shifted uncomfortably. "Elena's been having a rough time. The pregnancy's been hard on her." "Where were you headed?" Marcus asked. "In this weather?" Catherine and David exchanged a look. "We were trying to get to the hospital in Millbrook before the storm hit," Catherine said. "But we waited too long." Sarah noticed that Elena hadn't stopped staring at her since settling by the fire. The girl's eyes were an unusual pale blue, almost colorless, and there was something unsettling about the intensity of her gaze. "You have children," Elena said suddenly. It wasn't a question. We've been trying," Sarah admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't something she usually shared with strangers. Elena smiled for the first time since arriving. "I can tell. You have the look of someone who understands, someone who knows how precious new life is." Another contraction hit her then, stronger than before. Elena doubled over, her mug clattering to the floor. But instead of crying out in pain, she made a sound that was almost like laughter. "She's excited," Elena panted as the contraction passed. "She knows she's almost home." Catherine helped Elena sit back up, but Sarah caught the worried glance she shot toward David. There was something they weren't saying. something that went beyond concern for a young mother in labor. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind had taken on an almost animate quality, howling around their house like something alive and hungry. "I don't think anyone's going anywhere tonight," Marcus said, voicing what they were all thinking. "The roads will be completely impassable until this passes." Elena's strange smile widened. "That's perfect. She doesn't want to be born in some sterile hospital anyway. She wants to come into the world, somewhere warm, somewhere with people who'll understand what she needs." She reached out and grasped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm and somehow possessive. "You'll help me, won't you, when the time comes?" "How far apart are they?" David asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Sarah admired that about him, how he could find calm in the center of any storm. "Every 3 minutes now," Vera gasped, her pale hands gripping the armrest until her knuckles went white. "It's coming fast, faster than it should." The bearded man, Marcus, stood near the window, periodically wiping condensation from the glass to peer out into the howling darkness. "Still coming down hard," he muttered. "No way we're getting to any hospital tonight." Sarah felt her own baby shift restlessly inside her, as if responding to the tension in the room. She placed a protective hand over her belly, trying to ignore the way Vera's eyes tracked the movement with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I need to wash my hands," David said, moving toward the kitchen sink. "Sarah, can you find more towels? And maybe some scissors we can sterilize?" As Sarah gathered supplies from the linen closet, she caught fragments of whispered conversation between Vera and Marcus. Their words were too low to make out clearly, but there was something urgent about their exchange, something that didn't quite fit with the situation of an emergency delivery. "Told you it was too soon. Can't control the timing. If they suspect anything." Sarah's hands stilled on a stack of towels. Suspect anything? What could there be to suspect about a woman giving birth? Another contraction seized Vera, and this time her cry was different. Not quite pain, but something else. Something that sounded almost like ecstasy. The sound raised goosebumps along Sarah's arms, and she hurried back to the living room. "Here," she said, setting the towels within David's reach. He had rolled up his sleeves and was doing his best to look confident, though Sarah knew he was as unprepared for this as she was. "Thank you," Vera whispered, reaching out to grasp Sarah's wrist. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You understand, don't you? What it's like to carry life inside you." Sarah nodded, though something about the way Vera emphasized the word life made her uncomfortable. "When are you due?" "Soon," Vera said, which wasn't really an answer. "Very soon now." Marcus had moved away from the window and was pacing near the fireplace, his heavy boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. In the flickering light, his beard looked less brown than black, and Sarah noticed for the first time that his clothes, while wet from the snow, didn't seem quite right for someone who had been walking in a blizzard. They were too clean, too intact. "How long were you walking in the storm?" she asked him. He stopped pacing and looked at her with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "Long enough," he said simply. Another contraction hit Vera, stronger this time, and David positioned himself to help with the delivery. "I can see the head," he said, though his voice carried a note of confusion. "Vera, I need you to push on the next contraction, but—" He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "What is it?" Sarah asked, moving closer despite every instinct telling her to step back. "Wrong?" Vera finished for him, and there was a note of amusement in her voice that chilled Sarah to the bone. Or perhaps exactly right, depending on your perspective. The lights flickered then, as if the storm outside was reaching into their refuge with grasping fingers. In the brief moment of darkness, Sarah could have sworn she saw something impossible, a faint pulsing glow emanating from where Vera lay. When the lights steadied, everything appeared normal again, but the feeling of wrongness had settled into Sarah's bones like winter cold. "I think—" "I think maybe we should try to get to the hospital after all," she said, backing toward the door. "The storm might be letting up." "No," Vera said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. "It's too late for that now. Much too late." As if summoned by her words, another contraction seized her, and this time when she cried out, the sound seemed to echo from impossible directions, not just from her throat, but from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the very air around them. And in that echo, Sarah heard something that made her blood turn to ice. The sound of something answering from deep within the storm outside. The coffee had gone cold in Marcus's hands, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the frost-covered window at the endless white that had swallowed their world. The wind hadn't stopped howling since yesterday, and the drifts were already climbing past the first-floor windows. Sarah moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast for their unexpected guests. She'd always been the caretaker, the one who opened their home to strays and lost souls. It was one of the things he'd fallen in love with, though right now he wondered if her compassion might have finally gotten them into something they couldn't handle. "You're brooding again," Sarah said without turning around, cracking eggs into a bowl with mechanical precision. "Just thinking." Marcus took a sip of the bitter coffee and grimaced. "We don't know anything about them, Sarah. Nothing. I know Elena's pregnant and they needed help." She whisked the eggs harder than necessary. "That's enough for me." Marcus wanted to argue, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs made him close his mouth. Victor appeared first, his pale eyes scanning the room before settling on Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The man moved like a predator, all controlled grace and barely contained energy. "Good morning," Victor said, his accent thick as molasses. "I hope we did not wake you." "Not at all," Sarah replied before Marcus could answer. "How did Elena sleep?" "She rests still. The child is active today." Victor's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She will need much rest in the days to come." "Days." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "You think you'll be here that long?" Victor shrugged, settling into a chair at the table without invitation. "The storm, it does not ask our opinion, yes? We go when it allows." The weather radio crackled from its perch on the counter, cycling through the same emergency broadcasts they'd been hearing since yesterday. Road closures, power outages, travel advisories that might as well have been death sentences. They were truly cut off now, just the four of them in this house that suddenly felt far too small. Sarah placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of Victor, who stared at them for a long moment before pushing the plate away. "You are kind, but I do not eat these things." He gestured vaguely at the eggs. "My diet, it is specific." "Oh," Sarah looked flustered. "I have some fruit, or maybe—" "Do not trouble yourself. I will find what I need when the time comes." Something cold slithered down Marcus's spine at those words. He started to ask what Victor meant, but Elena's voice drifted down from upstairs, a low, keening sound that was part moan, part song. It rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic, the syllables foreign and guttural. Victor's head snapped toward the ceiling, his whole body going rigid. "Excuse me," he said, already rising from his chair. "She calls." He disappeared up the stairs with swift, silent steps, leaving Marcus and Sarah alone in the suddenly oppressive quiet. "What language was that?" Marcus asked, but Sarah was already moving toward the stairs, her maternal instincts overriding common sense. She might need help. That sounded like pain. Marcus caught her arm. "Wait." He kept his voice low, conscious of how sound carried in the old house. "Something's not right about them. She's pregnant and scared." "It's more than that." Marcus pulled her closer, searching her face. "You saw her eyes, Sarah. There's something wrong with her eyes." Sarah's expression softened, but he could see the stubborn set of her jaw. People look different when they're in pain, when they're desperate. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a different sound, wet, rhythmic, like meat being tenderized. Victor's voice joined in, speaking in the same foreign tongue Elena had been using. The words seemed to crawl along the walls, making the house itself feel unclean. "Sarah." Marcus gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Promise me you won't go up there alone." Before she could answer, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, heavy with a sense of completion that made Marcus's teeth ache. Footsteps crossed the floor above them, slow and deliberate. A door creaked open. "Sarah?" Elena's voice floated down, sweet as honey and twice as thick. "Could you come up, please? I need a woman's help with something." Sarah's face lit up with purpose, and Marcus felt his heart sink. She was already untying her apron, already moving toward the stairs before he could stop her. "I'll be right back," she whispered, kissing his cheek. Marcus watched her disappear up the stairs, every instinct screaming that he should follow. But Elena had asked specifically for Sarah, specifically for a woman's help. He sat back down at the kitchen table and waited, counting seconds that stretched like hours, while the wind howled outside and something else entirely stirred in the darkness above. The basement felt smaller, with all five of them huddled around the old wood stove, its orange glow casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Sarah had found some musty blankets in a storage chest, and they'd arranged themselves in a rough circle on the cold floor. The storm continued to rage above them, rattling the small windows near the ceiling with such violence that Marcus kept glancing up nervously. Elena sat with her back against the wall, one hand resting on her swollen belly. In the firelight, her skin looked almost translucent, blue veins visible beneath the surface like a roadmap of something Sarah couldn't quite name. The woman hadn't spoken much since they'd come downstairs, but her eyes never stopped moving, taking in every corner of the basement with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "How much longer until the baby comes?" David asked, trying to make conversation. He was good at that, filling uncomfortable silences. It was one of the things Sarah loved about him. Elena's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Soon. Very soon now." "First baby?" Sarah found herself asking, though she wasn't sure why. Something about Elena's demeanor suggested this wasn't her first experience with childbirth, despite appearing to be in her early 20s. "No." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not the first." The silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with implications none of them wanted to explore. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and furious. "Where are the others?" Sarah asked quietly. "Your other children, I mean." Elena's hand moved in slow circles over her stomach. "They served their purpose." The casual way she said it made Sarah's blood run cold. David must have felt her tense beside him because his hand found hers, squeezing gently, but she could feel the uncertainty in his grip too. "What kind of purpose?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with suspicion. Elena looked at him directly for the first time since they'd met her. Her eyes were pale grey, almost colourless, and in the flickering light they seemed to reflect rather than absorb. The kind that matters. The only kind that matters anymore. James had been quiet since they'd come downstairs, but now he leaned forward slightly. "You said earlier that you needed our help with the baby. What exactly did you mean by that?" "A birth requires witnesses," Elena said simply. "Participants. The old ways demand it." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The old ways? Before hospitals. Before doctors who think they understand the mysteries of life and death. Elena's voice took on an almost reverent quality. When people understood that bringing a soul into this world required more than just medical intervention. "That's just superstition," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena turned her unsettling gaze to him. "Is it? Your wife carries life within her too. Surely you understand that some things transcend medical science." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her own belly. She was only 3 months along, barely showing, but Elena's words made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she couldn't explain. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" James pressed. "When the time comes, and it will be tonight, I can feel it. I need you to bear witness, to participate in the welcoming. It's not difficult, but it is necessary. Participate how? Marcus had moved closer to James, Sarah noticed. The two men were positioning themselves protectively, though whether for her benefit or their own, she couldn't tell. Elena's smile widened, and Sarah caught a glimpse of her teeth. They seemed sharper than they should be, though perhaps it was just the firelight playing tricks. You'll know when the moment arrives. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten, what our ancestors knew by heart. A particularly violent gust of wind shook the house above them, and Sarah heard something crash. Maybe a tree branch, maybe something else. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving only the glow from the wood stove. In the deeper darkness, Elena's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The storm knows. It's been calling to me for days, drawing me here, drawing all of us here. She paused, and Sarah could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate. This is where it needs to happen. This is where it will begin. Where what will begin. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. The awakening, Elena said simply. The return of things that have been sleeping too long. As if in response to her words, something moved in Elena's belly. Not the normal flutter of an unborn child, but something that seemed to ripple across the surface of her skin like a wave. Sarah stared, transfixed and horrified, as the movement repeated, more pronounced this time. Elena noticed her staring and placed both hands over her stomach, almost protectively. Soon now, she murmured, and Sarah wasn't sure if she was talking to them or to whatever was growing inside her. Very soon. The basement door wouldn't budge. Marcus threw his shoulder against it again, the wood groaning but holding firm. Something heavy had been dragged in front of it. Furniture, maybe the old dresser from the hallway. His breath came in short bursts as he pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sound from above. Silence. Behind him, Sarah sat on the bottom step, her face pale in the dim light, filtering down from the crack under the door. She'd barely spoken since they'd heard Elena's screams cut off so abruptly 20 minutes ago. The sudden quiet had been worse than the screaming. "Try again," Sarah whispered, though her voice carried no real hope. Marcus examined the door frame, running his fingers along the hinges. They were old but solid, set deep into the wood. Even if he had tools, removing them would take hours. He kicked the door in frustration, immediately regretting the noise. "We need to think," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. "There has to be another way out." The basement was small, maybe 12 by 15 feet, with stone walls that wept moisture. Old paint cans lined wooden shelves along one wall, their labels too faded to read. A few cardboard boxes sat in the corner, their contents unknown. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Sarah stood and moved to the far wall, pressing her palms against the cold stone. "These are exterior walls," she said. "We're right under the back of the house." Marcus joined her, running his hands along the stones, searching for any weakness, any gap. His fingers found only solid masonry and the occasional strand of spiderweb. No windows, no other doors, no forgotten root cellar entrance that might lead outside. "What do you think happened up there?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He'd been trying not to think about Elena's final screams, the way they'd transformed from pain into something else, terror so pure it seemed to take on physical form, and then that wet, sliding sound that had followed the silence. "I don't know," he lied. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That baby she's carrying, when she was talking about it earlier, did you notice her stomach?" He had noticed, though he'd tried to dismiss the observation. Elena claimed to be 8 months pregnant, but her belly seemed oddly shaped, too angular in places, too soft in others. And the way it moved, not the gentle rolls of a baby shifting position, but something more aggressive, more purposeful. "Pregnancies can be different," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, He knew they sounded hollow. A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor directly over their heads. The steps paused, then continued toward what Marcus thought was the kitchen. Cabinets opened and closed. Something metallic clattered to the floor. "Elena?" Sarah called out, her voice cracking slightly. The footsteps stopped. They waited in the silence, hardly breathing. Marcus found himself counting heartbeats. His own rapid tempo, Sarah's slightly faster rhythm. The house above them might as well have been empty. Then Elena's voice drifted down through the floorboards, muffled but unmistakably hers. She was talking to someone, her tone conversational, almost cheerful. Marcus couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was wrong, too animated for someone who had just experienced whatever trauma had caused those screams. Who is she talking to? Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Marcus pressed his ear to the ceiling, straining to hear. Elena's voice rose and fell in the pattern of a two-way conversation, but he could only hear her side of it. She laughed at one point, a sound so normal and pleasant that it made his skin crawl. "Maybe Dave came back," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. Dave had left hours ago, well before the storm reached its peak. No one would be traveling in this weather unless they absolutely had to. The conversation above continued for several more minutes before fading away, Elena's voice growing distant as she moved to another part of the house. Marcus and Sarah remained motionless, afraid that any sound might draw her attention back to them. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said finally. "Whatever's happening, whatever she's planning." A new sound interrupted her, something heavy being dragged across the floor above, accompanied by Elena's voice again, this time strained with effort. The dragging sound moved from the living room toward the back of the house, then stopped. Marcus looked at Sarah, seeing his own fear reflected in her expression. They both understood, without speaking, that they were no longer guests seeking shelter from a storm. They were something else now, though neither wanted to voice exactly what that might be. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop another degree, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the single bulb's reach, something scurried across the stone floor. The basement felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls seeming to press closer as the wind howled above them like a living thing. Sarah had stopped counting the hours since they'd descended into this makeshift shelter, but the battery-powered radio crackled with increasingly dire weather reports. The storm wouldn't break for at least another day. Elena sat in the corner, her hands moving in slow, deliberate circles over her swollen belly. The motion should have been soothing, maternal, but there was something hypnotic about it that made Sarah's skin crawl. The pregnant woman's lips moved constantly in what might have been prayer, though the words were too soft to understand. "We should try to reach the neighbors," Marcus whispered to Sarah, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "The Hendersons have that ham radio set up." Sarah glanced toward the basement window, where snow had completely blocked their view of the outside world. "In this weather, it's suicide." David looked up from where he'd been sorting through their dwindling supplies. "Even if we could make it, their place is a quarter-mile through open field. We'd be frozen solid before we made it halfway." Elena's humming grew slightly louder, a melody none of them recognized. It seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls, creating an odd resonance that made their teeth ache. The baby kicked visibly beneath her dress, and Elena smiled with disturbing satisfaction. "Soon," she murmured, though whether to the child or to herself wasn't clear. Maya had been quiet for hours, huddled near the space heater with her arms wrapped around her knees. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained. "I keep having the same dream, about the baby. It's wrong somehow." "Dreams don't mean anything," David said quickly, but Sarah noticed he avoided looking at Elena as he spoke. "This one does." Maya's eyes were wide, pupils dilated despite the bright light from their emergency lanterns. "It's not just a baby, it's something else wearing a baby shape. And it's hungry." Elena's humming stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was worse than the eerie melody had been. She turned to look at Maya with an expression that was almost pitying. "You're beginning to understand," Elena said softly. "The veil grows thin in places like this, isolated, cut off from the ordinary world. The child knows. The child chooses where to emerge." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Elena struggled to her feet, her hand pressed against the small of her back. The baby's movements beneath her dress seemed more agitated now, creating ripples across the fabric that looked disturbingly unnatural. "It means you've been chosen, all of you, to witness, to help, to serve." "We never agreed to serve anything," Sarah said, backing toward the stairs despite knowing they led only to the storm's fury above. "Didn't you?" Elena's smile was serene, almost beatific. "When you opened your door, when you invited us in, when you offered shelter? These things matter. Hospitality creates bonds, obligations." David laughed, but the sound was hollow. "You're talking like we signed some kind of contract. This is insane." Elena moved closer to them, her gait awkward but determined. With each step, the temperature in the basement seemed to drop another degree, though the space heater continued to glow red. "The old ways are still the true ways. A threshold crossed, shelter given, protection offered. These create debts that must be honored." Maya scrambled backward until she hit the wall. "I can hear it," she whispered. "In my head. It's trying to get in." Elena nodded approvingly. "She's sensitive. Good. The birthing will be easier with a sensitive one to assist." "Nobody's assisting with anything," Marcus said, moving to put himself between Elena and Maya. "We'll help you get to a hospital when the storm clears, but that's it." Elena tilted her head, considering him with an expression that belonged on something ancient and predatory. "The hospital? Oh dear, Marcus. This child wasn't meant for sterile rooms and medical equipment. This birth requires older protocols, blood and earth and willing hands." The lights flickered suddenly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. In those brief moments of dimness, Elena's shadow seemed wrong somehow, too large, with angles that didn't match her human form. "The time grows short," Elena continued, pressing both hands to her belly as another violent kick rippled across her dress. "The child grows impatient, and when it decides to emerge, it will do so with or without your cooperation, but how much easier it would be with willing helpers." Sarah felt ice forming in her lungs with each breath. The basement walls seemed to pulse gently, as if the house itself had developed a heartbeat. Outside, the storm's howling took on new harmonics, almost like voices calling in languages that predated human speech. "What are you?" Sarah whispered. Elena's smile widened until it seemed to stretch beyond the natural limits of her face. "I'm a mother, and soon, very soon, you'll understand exactly what that means." The basement felt smaller, with 7 people crammed into it, their breath forming visible clouds in the frigid air. Marcus had positioned himself near the bottom of the stairs, his hunting rifle across his lap, while the others huddled around the dying embers in the old furnace. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, but down here, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by concrete walls, they had found a temporary sanctuary. Elena sat apart from the group, her back against the far wall, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She hadn't spoken much since they'd all descended into the basement hours ago, but her eyes never stopped moving, watching each of them with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "We need to talk about what happens next," David said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "This storm can't last forever." "And when it's over?" Tom asked, glancing nervously toward Elena. "What then?" Elena's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Then you'll have fulfilled your purpose." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah felt James tense beside her, his hand finding hers under the blanket they shared. Something was wrong, had been wrong from the moment Elena appeared at their door. The way she spoke, the strange symbols carved into that wooden box, the unnatural coldness that seemed to emanate from her presence. "What purpose?" Marcus's voice was steady, but Sarah could see his finger resting on the rifle's trigger guard. You keep talking like we're all part of some plan. Elena shifted, wincing slightly as she adjusted her position. 7 souls to witness the birth. 7 souls to anchor what's coming into this world. The old ways require witnesses, require sacrifice. The word hit them like a physical blow. Rachel whimpered and pressed closer to Tom, while David slowly stood, his hands raised in what he probably hoped was a calming gesture. Elena, you're not making sense, he said carefully. You're having a baby, that's all. We're just people who offered to help during a storm. Are you? Elena's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Or were you chosen, drawn here by forces beyond your understanding? Sarah's blood ran cold as memories surfaced, the strange dreams she'd been having for weeks, always featuring a woman in white walking through snow. The inexplicable urge that had made them choose this remote cabin for their vacation instead of somewhere warm and safe. The way the storm had come out of nowhere, as if summoned. This is insane, James muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Insanity is thinking the world operates by rules you understand. Insanity is believing that what grows inside me is merely human. As if responding to her words, something moved beneath her dress. Not the gentle flutter of a baby's kick, but something violent and unnatural. The fabric rippled and stretched in ways that defied anatomy, as if multiple limbs were pressing against her skin from within. Marcus raised his rifle. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. Does it? Elena's voice had changed, becoming deeper, echoing strangely in the confined space. Look around you, Marcus. Look at your precious weapon. Marcus glanced down and cursed. The metal of his rifle was covered in frost, and as he watched, ice began forming along the barrel. Within seconds, the entire weapon was encased in a shell of ice so thick it was useless. The temperature in the basement plummeted. Their breath became thick white clouds, and frost began forming on the walls. But Elena seemed unaffected. If anything, she appeared more vibrant, more alive. The cold calls to its own, she whispered. And what I carry was born in the spaces between winter and death, in the hungry dark that exists beyond human sight. Sarah tried to stand, but found her legs wouldn't obey. A creeping numbness was spreading up from her feet, and when she looked down, she saw ice crystals forming on her skin. Around the room, the others were experiencing the same thing, a supernatural cold that seemed to be freezing them from within. Please, Rachel gasped, her lips already turning blue. We have children, families, and they will thank you, Elena said, struggling to her feet. When the old gods walk the earth again, when the barriers between worlds crumble, they will remember the 7 who made it possible. The wooden box beside her began to glow with that same sickly light, and the symbols carved into its surface writhed like living things. The lid creaked open, revealing not empty space but a swirling darkness that seemed to pull at their vision, their sanity. Elena pressed both hands to her belly, and something inside responded with violent movement. Her dress tore as impossible shapes pressed against her skin, not one child but many things, all struggling to be born. It's time, she whispered, her eyes rolling back until only the white showed. The covenant is sealed, the witnesses are bound. Let the birthing begin. The darkness from the box began seeping out, flowing across the floor like liquid shadow, reaching toward their frozen forms with hungry tendrils. The storm had been their ally, masking the sounds from below, but now its fury was beginning to ebb. Sarah pressed her ear against the floorboards, listening to the rhythmic chanting that had resumed in the basement. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, but their cadence made her skin crawl, ancient syllables that seemed to twist in her mind long after they faded. Marcus crouched beside her, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the storm-lashed windows. We have to get out of here, he whispered, while they're distracted. Tom stood guard by the stairs, his hunting rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. The storm's letting up, but it's still suicide to leave. We'd freeze to death before we made it a mile. Better than staying here, Sarah hissed. She'd been studying the items they'd brought upstairs, candles, strange herbs, what looked like bone fragments carved with symbols. Whatever ritual Elena had planned, they were running out of time to stop it. A low moan echoed through the house, different from the wind. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, as if the structure was in pain. The sound was followed by Elena's voice, stronger now, calling out in that same otherworldly language. Her words had an urgency that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. "Something's happening," Marcus said, backing away from the window. Outside, the snow had taken on an odd luminescence, as if lit from within. The remaining trees swayed despite the diminishing wind, their movements too fluid, too purposeful. Tom joined them, abandoning his post at the stairs. The temperature just dropped 20 degrees. I can see my breath. Indeed, their exhalations now formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep through her clothes and into her bones. It wasn't the clean cold of winter. This was something else, something that carried the scent of decay and ancient earth. "It's not natural cold," she said. "It's coming from them." The chanting below reached a crescendo, and Elena's voice rose above the others in what sounded like a summoning. The house shuddered, and Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, a response from outside. It started as a whisper in the wind but grew stronger, multiple voices joining Elena's call from somewhere beyond the visible world. "We're not just trapped in a blizzard," Sarah realized with growing horror. "We're trapped between worlds." Marcus moved to another window, wiping away the condensation that had formed on the glass. "Christ," he breathed. "You need to see this." Sarah and Tom rushed to his side. Through the swirling snow, shapes were moving, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. They circled the house in a slow, deliberate pattern, their forms barely distinguishable from the storm except for the way they bent light around them. "What are they?" Tom's voice cracked with fear. Before anyone could answer, the chanting stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. Then they heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, measured, climbing toward them. "Elena," Sarah whispered. But when the figure appeared at the top of the stairs, Sarah barely recognized her. The woman's skin had taken on a translucent quality, and her eyes now held depths that shouldn't exist in a human face. Her pregnant belly seemed larger than before, moving with a life of its own beneath her dress. "You feel it, don't you?" Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. "The thinning, the barriers between worlds growing weak. My child isn't the only one crossing over tonight." Tom raised his rifle, but Elena merely smiled. "Iron and lead won't help you now. We're past such earthly concerns." Sarah stepped forward, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "What do you want from us?" "Witnesses," Elena replied. "Every birth needs witnesses, and every new world needs its first inhabitants." She placed both hands on her distended belly, and Sarah could see something moving beneath the skin, multiple somethings, pressing outward with increasing urgency. The figures outside had stopped circling and now pressed close to the house. Through the windows, Sarah could see their faces, or where faces should be. Instead, there were hollow spaces that seemed to pull at her vision, threatening to draw her consciousness into their depths. Elena doubled over suddenly, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. When she straightened, her smile was radiant and terrible. "It's time," she announced. "The convergence is complete. The old world ends tonight." The house began to shake more violently, and Sarah realized it wasn't just the building. The very ground beneath them was trembling. Outside, the storm was reforming, but now it carried more than snow and wind. Things moved within it, shapes that defied description, and Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that they were no longer dealing with anything remotely human. Elena's labor had begun, and with it, the birth of something that would change everything. The temperature in the cabin had dropped another 10 degrees since midnight, despite Marcus keeping the fire stoked. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders as she watched Elena pace the small living room, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other cradling her swollen belly. The pregnant woman's movements had become increasingly agitated over the past hour, and something about her restlessness made Sarah's skin crawl. "The contractions are getting closer," Elena announced, her voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction rather than pain or fear. "Maybe every 4 minutes now." David looked up from where he sat hunched over his laptop, still trying unsuccessfully to get a signal. "We need to get you to a hospital. This storm has to break soon." Elena's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Oh no, David. This baby isn't waiting for any storm to pass. Besides, hospitals are full of doctors who ask too many questions, run too many tests. Some things are better handled naturally, don't you think?" Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Marcus. There was something deeply unsettling about Elena's demeanor, too calm, too controlled for a woman about to give birth in a remote cabin during a blizzard. Most expectant mothers would be panicking by now. "At least let us help," Sarah offered, though every instinct screamed at her to stay away. "I took a first aid course. Marcus was pre-med before he switched majors." "How thoughtful." Elena's smile was predatory. "But I think you'll find this birth is quite different from anything you learned in your little classes." Another contraction seized her, and Elena doubled over with a guttural sound that was part groan, part growl. But when she straightened, her eyes held an unmistakable gleam of anticipation. She looked like someone receiving a long-awaited gift rather than enduring labor pains. Marcus stood abruptly, the fireplace poker still in his hand from tending the flames. "Elena, what exactly are you expecting us to help you with? Because I'm starting to think—" "Starting to think what?" Thomas's voice cut through the room like a blade. None of them had noticed him emerge from the bedroom where he'd been resting. His pale face looked even more gaunt in the firelight, and his eyes held the same disturbing gleam as his wife's. "That something isn't quite right here?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The way Thomas and Elena looked at them, like predators sizing up prey, made her mouth go dry. She slowly reached for her phone, though she knew it was useless without signal. "The thing is," Elena continued, moving to stand beside her husband, "this baby needs very specific conditions to thrive. A particular kind of nourishment, a certain type of environment." David snapped his laptop shut with shaking hands. "What are you talking about?" Elena's next contraction was stronger, bending her nearly in half. When it passed, she was breathing hard, but her smile had grown wider. "You've all been so kind, so welcoming, opening your home to strangers, offering to help with the birth. It's exactly the sort of generosity this child will need to survive its first few hours." Thomas moved closer to the group, and Sarah noticed for the first time how his fingernails had grown long and yellowed, more like claws than human nails. "The old ways are best for creatures like our child. Traditional birthing practices, traditional feeding methods." "Feeding methods?" Marcus raised the poker slightly, his knuckles white around the handle. "Oh yes," Elena panted. Another contraction building. "This one will be hungry when it arrives, so very, very hungry. And what better welcome to the world than a warm meal waiting?" Her gaze swept over Sarah, David, and Marcus with unmistakable hunger. Sarah felt ice-cold terror flood her veins. "You're insane, both of you." "Are we?" Thomas tilted his head with mock curiosity. "Or are we simply devoted parents, preparing the best possible start in life for our offspring? You wanted to help with the birth, didn't you? Well, here's your chance to truly contribute." Elena cried out again, this contraction lasting longer than the others. When it ended, she looked directly at Sarah. "It's almost time. The child is eager to meet you all. I can feel it moving, positioning itself, getting ready to feed." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Sarah, brandishing the poker. "Nobody's feeding on anyone. I don't know what kind of sick game this is, but it ends now." "Oh, Marcus." Elena's voice was almost pitying. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't a game. This is nature. This is survival. This is what real love looks like when you're carrying something that transcends ordinary human limitations. The wind howled around the cabin with renewed fury, rattling the windows and making the flames in the fireplace dance wildly. Outside, the blizzard showed no signs of weakening, trapping them all together in the growing nightmare. Elena gasped suddenly, her water breaking in a rush of fluid that looked too dark, too thick in the dim light. "It's time," she whispered, her voice filled with unholy reverence. "Our child is ready to be born." The basement had become their prison, and Sarah could feel the walls closing in with each labored breath. The contractions were coming faster now, each one a violent seizure that sent shockwaves through her distended belly. But what emerged during each spasm wasn't just pain. It was something else entirely, something that made the shadows dance and writhe in impossible patterns. "We have to get out of here," Marcus whispered to Elena, his voice barely audible over Sarah's increasingly inhuman sounds. The pregnant woman had changed since they'd been forced down here. Her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, and dark veins spiderwebbed across her face like cracks in porcelain. Elena clutched David closer to her chest, feeling his small body trembling against her. The boy hadn't spoken since witnessing what had happened to Tom upstairs. His wide eyes stared at nothing, reflecting a terror that no child should ever know. "The storm," she mouthed back to Marcus. "It's still—" A shriek from Sarah cut her off, but this time it wasn't entirely human. The sound contained harmonics that shouldn't exist, frequencies that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. The single bulb overhead flickered, casting strobing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "It's coming," Sarah panted, her head thrown back in what could have been ecstasy or agony. "Oh God, it's finally coming." Her hands clawed at the air above her swollen stomach, as if she could reach through her own flesh to whatever waited inside. Marcus had been quietly working at the basement window, trying to clear enough snow to create an escape route. The glass was old and warped, and the frame had swollen with moisture, but it was their only option besides the stairs that led back up to Tom's body. He pressed harder against the frame, feeling something give slightly. "Almost got it," he breathed, then froze as Sarah's laughter filled the basement. It wasn't the laugh of a woman in labor. It was the sound of something pretending to be human, something that had studied laughter but never truly understood it. The noise seemed to come from multiple throats at once, harmonizing with itself in ways that made reality feel unstable. "You think you can leave?" Sarah's voice had changed too, becoming deeper, resonant with an authority that seemed to press against their minds. "You think this is about choice anymore?" She struggled to sit up, her movements jerky and unnatural. "We're all part of this now, all of us." Elena looked down at David and saw her own horror reflected in his glassy stare. The boy's lips were moving silently, and she realized with growing dread that he was counting 1, 2, 3, 4 over and over again, as if the numbers were the only thing keeping him anchored to sanity. The basement walls seemed to pulse in rhythm, with Sarah's contractions now, breathing in and out like the inside of some massive lung. The very foundation of the house groaned and settled with each spasm, as if the building itself were participating in whatever unholy birth was taking place. "Marcus," Elena whispered urgently, seeing something that made her blood freeze. The puddle of water beneath Sarah, what she'd assumed was amniotic fluid, was moving. Not flowing or spreading, but actually moving, with purpose and direction. Dark tendrils of liquid crept across the basement floor like seeking fingers. Marcus turned from the window just as one of the tendrils touched his boot. The liquid immediately began to climb, defying gravity as it wrapped around his ankle like a living thing. He stumbled backward, kicking frantically, but the substance held fast. "What the hell?" He grabbed at the dark fluid, trying to scrape it off, but it burned his fingers like acid. The pain was immediate and intense, but worse was the way it seemed to whisper against his skin, promising things he couldn't quite understand, but knew he never wanted to hear. Sarah's laughter grew louder as more tendrils emerged from beneath her, spreading across the basement floor like an oil spill with malevolent intelligence. "It needs to touch you," she gasped between contractions. Needs to know you, taste you. You're going to be such wonderful vessels. Elena backed toward the far corner, pressing David against the wall behind her. The boy had stopped counting and was now humming, a tuneless, repetitive sound that somehow seemed to keep the creeping darkness at bay. She didn't understand how or why, but the space immediately around her son remained clear while the rest of the basement filled with writhing shadows. The window frame gave way with a sudden crack, and Marcus tumbled backward as freezing air rushed into the basement. Snow swirled through the opening, but instead of the relief he'd expected, the cold seemed to energize whatever was happening to Sarah. Her contractions intensified, and the house itself began to shake. Now, Elena whispered to David, not knowing if he could hear her. We have to go now. But as she lifted the boy toward the window, Sarah's next scream shattered the basement bulb, plunging them into a darkness that felt alive and hungry. The basement had become their tomb, and Sarah knew it. The scratching above had stopped an hour ago, replaced by something far worse, silence that pressed down like the weight of the entire house. Marcus sat against the far wall, his makeshift bandage dark with blood that wouldn't stop seeping through. David paced the small space like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the barricaded door. We can't stay here, David whispered, though his voice seemed to echo in the cramped space. Whatever's up there, it's waiting. Sarah pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her. The movements had become more violent since the confrontation with Elena, as if the thing growing within could sense the proximity of its intended mother. Each kick sent waves of nausea through her, and she fought to keep from retching. The tunnel, Marcus said weakly from his corner, behind the water heater, saw it when we first came down, might lead outside. David's head snapped toward the ancient water heater that hulked in the shadows. You sure? My grandfather had one. Coal delivery chute maybe, worth checking. Sarah wanted to laugh at the desperate hope in their voices, but another violent kick stole her breath. When she gasped, both men turned toward her with expressions she'd seen too often in the past few hours, the look of people watching a bomb tick down to zero. Sarah? David's voice was gentle, but she could hear the fear underneath. She couldn't tell them what she felt, couldn't explain how the baby seemed to respond to Elena's presence somewhere above them, how it moved with purpose now, rather than the random kicks of a normal child. The Latin words Elena had whispered during their last encounter kept echoing in her mind, syllables that made her skin crawl even though she didn't understand their meaning. David had already moved to the water heater, running his hands along the wall behind it. His breathing quickened. There's something here. Help me move this. Marcus struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. Together they managed to shift the old heater enough to reveal a narrow opening in the foundation wall. Cold air whispered through the gap, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something organic and rotten that made Sarah's stomach lurch. It goes up, David said, shining his phone's flashlight into the opening. I can see daylight, but what? There's something blocking part of it. Can't tell what. Another contraction hit Sarah, stronger than before, and she doubled over. This time she couldn't hold back the scream. The sound echoed off the basement walls, and immediately they heard movement from above, footsteps crossing the floor, deliberate and unhurried. She knows where we are, Marcus said. David was already at Sarah's side, helping her stand. We go now. Can you make it through there? Sarah looked at the narrow opening and felt despair wash over her. Even without the pregnancy, it would be a tight fit. With her swollen belly, it seemed impossible. But the alternative was staying here, while Elena did whatever she planned to do. I'll try. They heard the basement door rattle. Elena's voice drifted down the stairs, sweet and reasonable. Sarah, dear, fighting this will only make it harder. The child wants to come to me. Can't you feel it? Another contraction, and Sarah gasped. The baby was moving constantly now, pressing against her ribs, shifting position as if seeking the best angle for escape. She touched her belly and felt something that made her blood freeze. the unmistakable outline of tiny fingers pressed against her skin from the inside, feeling along her abdomen as if testing for weaknesses. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What is it?" David asked. She couldn't answer. The fingerprints against her skin were too deliberate, too intelligent for a child that shouldn't even be fully formed yet. Elena's laughter echoed down the stairs, as if she could sense what was happening. "Go," Sarah managed. "David, you go first." He squeezed through the opening with surprising ease. Marcus followed, grunting with pain as he scraped past the rough concrete. Then it was Sarah's turn. The opening seemed to shrink as she approached it. She went in sideways, David's hands guiding her from above. The concrete scraped against her back and belly, and she felt a moment of panic as her shoulders wedged tight. Behind her, she could hear Elena's footsteps on the basement stairs. "Almost there," David whispered. "Just a little more." With a final desperate push, Sarah squeezed through. David pulled her up into what looked like an old coal chute that angled sharply toward a rectangle of grey daylight above. But as Marcus had warned, something was blocking most of the opening. As her eyes adjusted, Sarah realized what the obstruction was, and her scream froze in her throat. Bodies, at least 3 of them, twisted and frozen in the narrow chute like a cork in a bottle. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since midnight, and the wind howled through the gaps in the boarded windows like wounded animals. Sarah pressed her back against the kitchen door, listening to the sounds coming from upstairs, rhythmic chanting mixed with what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. "We have to leave," Marcus whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Now, while they're distracted." Elena shook her head violently. "The storm's gotten worse. We won't make it 50 feet. She pointed toward the living room where the front door stood, barricaded with everything they could move against it. "Besides, they'll hear us trying to clear the exit." David had been silent for the past hour, staring at the crude symbols carved into the kitchen table's surface. The pregnant woman, if she was even human anymore, had etched them there while humming a lullaby that made their teeth ache. "These markings," he said finally, tracing one with a trembling finger. "I've seen them before." "Where?" Sarah demanded. "My grandmother's journals. She documented strange occurrences in rural communities during the 1940s. Disappearances, unexplained births." His voice dropped to barely audible. "She called them harvest rituals." The chanting upstairs grew louder, more urgent. Through the ceiling, they could see the floorboards sagging slightly, as if bearing enormous weight. Something was wrong with the physics of the house itself. Shadows fell in impossible directions, and the walls seemed to pulse with a subtle, organic rhythm. "Harvest of what?" Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he didn't want to know the answer. Before David could respond, the lights went out completely. The generator had finally succumbed to the cold, leaving them in absolute darkness. In the sudden silence, they could hear their own heartbeats echoing strangely, as if the house were amplifying the sound. A new voice joined the chanting, male, deep, speaking in a language that predated human civilization. Thomas was awake. "The baby," Elena whispered. "When I helped her earlier, I felt it moving. But it wasn't normal movement. It was like something swimming in thick fluid, changing shape." Sarah fumbled for the flashlight they'd kept in the kitchen drawer, her hands shaking as she clicked it on. The beam revealed that the symbols on the table were glowing faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the chanting above. Worse, similar markings had appeared on the walls around them, carved deep into the wood as if by invisible claws. "She's not pregnant," David said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. "She's incubating." The distinction sent ice through their veins. On the ceiling above, they could see dark stains spreading across the wood. Not water damage, but something organic seeping through from upstairs. The acrid smell of copper and sulfur began filtering down. Marcus moved toward the kitchen window, desperate to find another way out. As he pulled aside the curtain, his scream died in his throat. Pressed against the glass was a hand, but with too many joints, too many fingers. It tapped against the window in a deliberate pattern, almost playful. "It's not the storm keeping us here," Elena realized. We're surrounded. The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the house shuddered as if struck by lightning. In the aftermath, they heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound. The pregnant woman was coming down. Sarah grabbed a knife from the counter, though she doubted it would be effective against whatever was descending toward them. The footsteps paused halfway down the staircase, and when the woman spoke, her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "The vessels are prepared," she announced. "The incubation requires witnesses, fresh ones." Elena pressed herself against the far wall. "Vessels for what?" "She's been collecting people for years," David whispered, understanding flooding through him. The desperate, the lost, anyone who would come seeking shelter. He looked at each of them with growing horror. "We're not the first group to arrive here during a storm." Through the doorway they could see her silhouette on the stairs. Her belly had distended even further, moving with independent life. What was growing inside her was ready to emerge, and when it did, it would need bodies to inhabit, minds to consume. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and their breath came in ragged clouds as the entity above completed its descent. Each step brought it closer, and with each step, the house itself seemed to wake up around them, walls breathing, floors shifting, the very foundation groaning as if alive. Marcus gripped Elena's hand. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "don't let it touch you." But as the kitchen door slowly began to open, pushed by something that cast no shadow in their flashlight beam, they realized that choice might no longer be theirs to make. The harvest had begun. The basement had become a tomb of whispered prayers and desperate plans. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone wall, watching as Marcus carefully sorted through their remaining supplies by the weak light of a dying flashlight. 3 protein bars, 2 bottles of water, and a handful of matches, not nearly enough to outlast whatever horror was growing stronger upstairs. "The contractions are getting closer together," Elena whispered from her makeshift bed of old blankets. Her face had taken on an otherworldly pallor, and dark veins had begun to spider across her temples like ink seeping through paper. "It won't be long now." David paced near the basement stairs, his injured leg dragging slightly. "We can't just sit here waiting for this thing to be born. There has to be another way out." "I've checked every corner," Marcus replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "The storm cellar door is frozen solid, and even if we could break through, we'd be walking into that blizzard with nothing but the clothes on our backs." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her own belly. The baby had been unusually quiet for the past hour, as if sensing the malevolent presence above them. She thought about normal births, normal babies crying their first breath in sterile hospital rooms, surrounded by doctors and relieved parents. This was the antithesis of everything natural and good. A low moan echoed from Elena, but it wasn't entirely human. The sound carried undertones that seemed to vibrate through the foundation itself, making the old mason jars on the storage shelves rattle ominously. Whatever was inside her was eager to emerge. "Tell us about the father," Sarah demanded, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "You keep saying we need to understand, so help us understand. What did you do to conceive this thing?" Elena's laugh was bitter and broken. "Do you really want to know? Do you want to understand what it means to be barren for 15 years, to feel empty and worthless while everyone around you holds their perfect babies, to pray to every god and make every bargain until something finally answers?" "What answered?" Marcus asked quietly, setting down the flashlight so its beam illuminated Elena's twisted features. "Something old. Something that was waiting in the spaces between prayers, in the silence that follows desperate pleas." Elena's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. "It came to me in dreams first, promising me a child unlike any other. All I had to do was prepare the way, gather the witnesses, ensure the proper welcome for its arrival." David stopped pacing. "Witnesses? Is that what we are?" "Among other things." Elena's voice had taken on a different quality, as if multiple speakers were layering their words together. "The birth requires observation, requires others to acknowledge what comes into this world." Without witnesses, it remains trapped between realms. Sarah felt ice form in her veins. That's why you sought us out. That's why you came here specifically. The storm wasn't chance, Elena confirmed. It was summoned, drawn by the approaching birth. And you— She fixed her gaze on Sarah with predatory intensity. You carry life within you as well. Your child will serve as an anchor, ensuring mine can fully manifest in this realm. Like hell, David snarled, moving toward Elena despite his injury. The basement temperature plummeted instantly. The flashlight flickered and dimmed as frost began forming on every surface. Elena's back arched impossibly high, and the sound that emerged from her throat was like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "It's starting," she gasped when the convulsion passed. "You can try to stop it, but you'll only make things worse for yourselves. This child has been promised the world, and I intend to deliver." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "The stairs. We need to get upstairs." "Into that blizzard," Sarah protested. "Better to freeze to death than witness whatever she's about to unleash down here," he replied grimly. They moved toward the stairs, but Elena's voice stopped them cold. "You cannot leave. The entity that fathered my child has ensured that. Look at your exit, David. Really look." David reached for the door handle and recoiled immediately. Where wood and metal should have been, his fingers met something that felt like wet flesh. The basement door had somehow transformed into a membrane of skin and sinew, pulsing with a rhythm that matched Elena's labored breathing. "The house itself has become part of the birthing chamber," Elena explained with perverse satisfaction. "Every room, every window, every possible escape route has been sealed until the delivery is complete. You are here until the very end, whether you choose to help or not." Sarah sank to her knees as another impossibly cold wave washed over them. Her own baby kicked frantically, as if trying to escape what was coming. Above them, the storm howled with increasing fury, and she realized with growing horror that the wind sounded almost like breathing, something massive drawing air into enormous lungs. The labor was accelerating, and with each of Elena's contractions, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around them. The basement air grew thick with anticipation as Sarah's contractions intensified. Each wave seemed to pull something deeper from within her, something that fought against the natural rhythm of birth. The candles flickered wildly despite the absence of any breeze, casting writhing shadows that moved independently of their flames. Marcus pressed his back against the cold stone wall, watching in horrified fascination as the woman who had begged for their shelter revealed her true purpose. The strange symbols carved into her distended belly had begun to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, pulsing in time with her labored breathing. "You don't understand what you're witnessing," Sarah gasped between contractions, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "This child will remake everything. The old world is dying anyway. Look around you. The storms, the cold, the endless winter. This is just the beginning of the cleansing." Elena clutched David's arm, feeling their own unborn child shift restlessly within her womb. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Her baby had been still for hours, but now it writhed as if responding to Sarah's words, to the dark energy filling the basement. "The blizzard," David whispered, pieces clicking into place. "It followed you here, didn't it? This isn't natural weather." Sarah's laugh came out as a harsh bark. "Nothing about this is natural. I've been carrying this gift for 11 months, waiting for the right moment, the right witnesses. You were chosen, all of you. Your presence gives it strength." Thomas had retreated to the far corner, his weathered face pale with recognition. He'd seen something like this before, decades ago in the old country. His grandmother had told stories, warnings disguised as folklore about women who made bargains with things that should remain unnamed. "The father," he croaked. "Where is the father?" Sarah's smile widened impossibly, stretching her features into something inhuman. "Which one? The thing that took my husband's form in the woods, the shadow that whispered promises in my dreams, or the ancient hunger that planted its seed in my willing flesh?" Another contraction seized her, and she doubled over, black fluid seeping through the cracks in the basement floor where she knelt. The temperature plummeted further. Their breath came out in visible puffs now, and frost began forming on the walls. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but underneath that sound came something else, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Marcus realized with growing horror that the basement wasn't just their shelter, it was a trap. Sarah had guided them here deliberately, to this specific location. The symbols on the walls weren't random scratches, but part of something larger, a pattern that extended beyond what they could see. "We have to get out of here," he said, moving toward the stairs. "Too late," Sarah panted. "The circle is complete. The witnesses are gathered. My child needs your warmth, your life force, to fully manifest in this world." Elena felt a sharp pain lance through her abdomen. Her water broke in a warm rush, but the fluid was wrong, too dark, too thick. David caught her as she stumbled, and they both stared in shock at the black stains spreading across the floor. "What's happening to us?" Elena whispered. "She's feeding on you," Thomas said grimly. "On all of us. That thing she's carrying, it's not just taking from her body, it's drawing from every living thing around it." Sarah's breathing had become a rhythmic chanting in a language none of them recognized. The words seemed to crawl through the air like living things, wrapping around their throats and making it hard to breathe. The symbols on her body blazed brighter, and answering marks began appearing on the basement walls, a vast ritual circle with them trapped at its center. Marcus lunged for the stairs, but an invisible force slammed him back against the wall. The old wooden steps crumbled to dust, sealing them in. Panic flooded through him as he realized Sarah had been planning this from the moment she'd knocked on their door. Elena's contractions were coming faster now, synchronized with Sarah's. Whatever was happening to the other woman was affecting her pregnancy, forcing her own child toward premature birth. She could feel something changing inside her, her baby's movements becoming frantic and desperate. "Fight it," David urged, holding his wife close. "Don't let it take our child." But Sarah's laughter filled the basement, echoing off the stone walls with unnatural resonance. "Your child? It was never just yours. The moment you let me in, the moment you showed compassion to a stranger in need, you became part of the ritual. Your baby will be born tonight too, but not as the human you expect." The candle flames suddenly extinguished, plunging them into absolute darkness. In that lightless void, Sarah's voice continued its alien chanting, and something vast and hungry stirred in the spaces between worlds, preparing to claw its way into reality through the bodies of two unwilling mothers. The real nightmare was only beginning. The cellar door splintered inward with a sound like breaking bones. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, Marcus's hunting rifle heavy in her trembling hands. Above them, footsteps moved with unnatural coordination. Too many feet, moving in perfect synchronization. "They're not Elena anymore," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that still howled through the house. "Whatever she birthed up there, it's spreading." Sarah's finger found the trigger. She'd never fired a gun before tonight, but desperation had a way of teaching quick lessons. The basement felt smaller with each passing second, the shadows seeming to pulse with their own malevolent life. A wet, sliding sound echoed from the stairs. Something was descending, multiple somethings, their movements creating a symphony of organic horror. Sarah caught a glimpse of what had once been Tom's leg, now elongated and twisted, followed by an arm that bent in too many places. "The tunnel," Marcus breathed, pointing toward the far corner where his grandfather's old root cellar connected to a network of underground passages. "It leads to the barn." They moved in silence, their footsteps masked by the increasingly violent sounds from above. The narrow passage reeked of earth and decay, but Sarah forced herself forward, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. Behind them, something wet hit the basement floor with a sickening splat. The tunnel stretched endlessly in the darkness. Sarah's lungs burned, her pregnant belly making each step an exercise in willpower, but the alternative, becoming part of whatever Elena had unleashed, drove her forward. The sound of pursuit grew closer, a rhythmic scraping that suggested their pursuers were no longer entirely human in their locomotion. A sliver of grey light appeared ahead. Dawn was breaking, though it brought no comfort. As they emerged into the barn, Sarah saw the true scope of the horror. The house across the yard writhed like a living thing, its walls bulging and contracting. Dark tendrils emerged from broken windows, tasting the air with obscene curiosity. "Oh my God!" Marcus gasped. "It's transforming everything." The snow around the house had taken on a pinkish hue, and where it touched the barn's foundation, Sarah could see the wood beginning to soften and change. Whatever Elena had given birth to wasn't just creating hybrid offspring, it was converting the entire environment into something alien. A scream pierced the morning air, but it wasn't human. The sound held harmonics that made Sarah's bones ache, a call that seemed to resonate from everywhere at once. In response, the transformed house pulsed brighter, and she realized with growing horror that they were witnessing some form of communication. "We need to reach the road," she said, checking the rifle's ammunition with shaking hands. "Warn people. Stop this from spreading." Marcus nodded toward his truck, half buried in the storm's aftermath but potentially functional. They'd have to cross 50 yards of open ground, past the house and whatever it had become. As if sensing their intention, several appendages emerged from the structure, weaving through the air like grotesque antennae. "When I count to 3, Marcus whispered. Sarah never heard him reach 3. The barn wall behind them exploded inward, and Tom's transformed body emerged. But calling it Tom was generous. The thing retained his basic shape but had gained additional limbs that sprouted from impossible angles. His eyes had multiplied, creating a crown of unblinking orbs around his skull. The rifle bucked in Sarah's hands. The shot took the creature center mass, but instead of falling, it simply paused, examining the wound with scientific curiosity. Black ichor seeped from the hole, but the thing that had been Tom seemed more interested than injured. Marcus grabbed her hand and they ran. Behind them, the creature's voice joined the horrible harmony filling the air, a sound that made the morning itself seem to recoil. They sprinted across the yard as more shapes emerged from the house. Elena's impossible children, born fully formed and eager to spread their influence. The truck's door handle was frozen solid. Marcus hammered at it with his fist, while Sarah kept the rifle trained on their pursuers. The creatures moved with deliberate patience, as if they knew escape was ultimately impossible. One of them, a thing that might once have been Elena herself, raised what could charitably be called a hand in a gesture that was almost friendly. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing to life in the frigid air. As they pulled away, Sarah watched the transformed house recede in the side mirror, but her relief was short-lived. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from other homesteads, other places where the storm had driven desperate people to seek shelter. The infection was spreading faster than any blizzard, carried by the simple human impulse to help those in need. By the time they reached the main road, Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that they weren't escaping. They were simply witnesses to the beginning of something vast and hungry that had found the perfect world in which to flourish. The basement walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, veins of ice crackling through the concrete as Sarah's labor intensified. Each contraction brought with it a bone-deep cold that made the blizzard outside feel like a summer breeze. Maya pressed herself against the far wall, watching in horrified fascination as the pregnant woman's body began to change. Sarah's skin had taken on a translucent quality, blue-white like fresh snow, and her breath came out in crystalline puffs that didn't dissipate, but instead drifted upward to form intricate patterns on the ceiling. The ritual circle Tom had carved into the floor began to glow with an otherworldly light, each symbol pulsing in rhythm with Sarah's increasingly labored breathing. "It's almost time," Sarah gasped, her voice carrying harmonics that made Maya's teeth ache. "The hunger has been patient, but it won't wait much longer." Tom moved around the circle with practiced efficiency, adjusting candles and muttering incantations in a language that predated human speech. The words seemed to bite at the air itself, leaving visible tears in reality that showed glimpses of a realm where winter was eternal and nothing lived but cold, consuming need. Maya tried to move, to run, but her feet were frozen to the floor, literally. Ice had grown up around her ankles like shackles, binding her in place as the temperature continued to plummet. Her breath came in sharp bursts that burned her lungs, and she could feel frostbite beginning to nip at her fingers and toes. "Why are you doing this?" she managed through chattering teeth. Sarah's laugh was like wind chimes made of icicles. "Because I was chosen. Because the old gods hunger for a world that remembers true winter. Your modern civilization has forgotten what cold really means. Forgotten that survival requires sacrifice." Another contraction racked Sarah's body, and this time Maya could see something moving beneath her skin, something that pressed outward with sharp angles and impossible geometries. The fabric of Sarah's dress began to tear, not from the strain of childbirth, but from the temperature, the fibers, becoming brittle as glass in the supernatural cold. "The hunger showed me the truth," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an evangelical fervor. "Showed me what this world will become when the ice returns. Clean, pure, empty of all the weakness and warmth that's made humanity soft." Tom completed another circle around the ritual space, and with each pass, the basement grew darker despite the growing luminescence from the symbols. The darkness wasn't an absence of light, but a presence of something else, a hungry void that seemed to pull heat and life toward it. Maya felt her strength ebbing, sapped by the cold and whatever eldritch forces were gathering in the small space. She could see her own breath forming complex patterns now, pulled into the same supernatural system that was preparing to birth something monstrous into their world. "The child won't be human," Sarah said, and for the first time, Maya heard something like uncertainty in her voice. "But it will be perfect. It will be winter itself, given form and hunger and purpose." The contractions were coming faster now, and with each one, the temperature dropped another few degrees. Maya could feel ice forming on her eyelashes, could see frost creeping across every surface in the basement. The walls themselves were groaning under the supernatural cold, cracks spreading like spiderwebs as the very foundation of the house protested against what was happening within it. Tom's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the ritual circle blazed with light so cold it burned. Maya squeezed her eyes shut against the glare, but even through her closed lids she could see the terrible illumination. When she forced them open again, Sarah was no longer entirely human. Her limbs had elongated, joints bending in ways that defied anatomy, and her skin had become completely transparent, showing a circulatory system that pulsed with liquid ice instead of blood. Her eyes had gone completely white, reflecting the ritual light like fresh snow under moonlight. "I can feel it," Sarah whispered, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The hunger, it's ready to be born." The basement shook with a rumble that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth, as if something vast was stirring in response to the ritual. Dust and ice fell from the ceiling in equal measure, and Maya could hear the house above them creaking and groaning as if it were being twisted by invisible hands. Tom stepped back from the circle, his work complete, and Maya could see the fear in his eyes, even as he smiled in triumph. Whatever they had summoned, whatever they were bringing into the world, it was beyond their control now. Sarah's scream split the air, but it wasn't the cry of a woman in labor. It was the howl of a winter storm given voice, promising death and desolation to everything it touched. The sound shattered every piece of glass in the basement and sent vibrations through the floor that Maya could feel in her bones. The birth was beginning. The contractions came faster now, each wave of pain accompanied by something that felt fundamentally wrong. Sarah gripped the bed frame until her knuckles went white, sweat beading on her forehead despite the Arctic cold seeping through the cabin's walls. The blizzard still raged outside, but the howling wind seemed almost gentle compared to the sounds emerging from within her. "Something's happening," she gasped, though the words felt inadequate. Something had been happening for weeks now, ever since she'd first felt the thing inside her respond to her thoughts with an intelligence that no unborn child should possess. Marcus stood frozen by the door, his face pale as he watched his wife writhe on the blood-stained sheets. The other survivors huddled in the far corner of the cabin, their earlier attempts to help abandoned once they'd seen the true nature of what Sarah carried. The scratches on the cabin walls had grown deeper overnight, carved from the inside of her womb with what could only be claws. "We have to get out of here," whispered Elena, the nurse who'd tried to help with the delivery until she'd felt something grab her wrist from within Sarah's body. Before it what?" Marcus snapped, though his voice cracked with terror. "She's still my wife. That's still our—" His words died as Sarah's scream split the air, a sound no human throat should make. The temperature in the cabin plummeted another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the windows from the inside. The thing wanted out, and reality itself seemed to bend around its impatience. Sarah's eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made everyone's teeth ache. "It's time. It's finally time." But the words came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the cabin itself had learned to speak. The contractions intensified, and with each one, the shadows in the room grew longer, reaching towards Sarah like eager midwives. The candles they'd been using for light began to flicker, their flames turning an impossible shade of blue. Outside, the blizzard's fury seemed to pulse in rhythm with Sarah's labor, as if the storm itself was breathing. Marcus took a step forward, paternal instinct warring with primal terror. "Sarah, look at me. Stay with me." But Sarah was beyond hearing human voices now. Her body arched impossibly, spine bending at angles that should have snapped bone, and something pressed against her skin from within. Not the shape of a child's head, but something with too many angles, too many joints. The bulge moved beneath her flesh, like a spider beneath silk, seeking the weakest point to tear through. Elena grabbed old Tom's arm, the grizzled trapper who'd taken shelter with them days ago. "The back door," she whispered urgently, "while it's distracted." But Tom shook his head, his weathered face grim. "Won't matter. Thing like this, distance don't mean nothing. It's been calling to something out there in the storm. You hear them voices on the wind? They're answering." And he was right. Through the howling of the blizzard came other sounds, voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech, promising things that made sanity recoil. The thing in Sarah's womb wasn't just being born. It was arriving, like an ambassador from a realm where natural laws were mere suggestions. Sarah's body convulsed one final time, and the sound that emerged wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a birth cry, but something that existed in the space between life and something else entirely. The shadows in the room suddenly snapped back to their normal lengths, the candles steadied to normal flame, and a profound silence fell over the cabin. For a moment, hope flickered in Marcus's chest. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been growing inside Sarah had simply failed to survive the birthing process. Maybe the cold, or the stress, or simple biology had won out over whatever impossible thing had been trying to claw its way into their world. Then Sarah sat up on the bed, moving with fluid grace despite having just given birth. Her eyes were completely black now, reflecting the candlelight like obsidian mirrors. In her arms she cradled something wrapped in the torn remains of her nightgown, something that was perfectly still and quiet. "Would you like to meet your child?" she asked Marcus, and her voice was honey and poison mixed together. "It's been so looking forward to meeting its father." The bundle in her arms shifted slightly, and a sound emerged from it, not a baby's cry, but something like wind through a graveyard, like the last breath leaving a dying world. Whatever Sarah had given birth to was very much alive, and it was hungry. Marcus took an involuntary step backward as Sarah rose from the bed, still cradling the thing she'd birthed. Outside, the blizzard began to subside, but the voices in the wind grew louder, closer. The real nightmare was just beginning.